In this episode, we discuss the story of Lauren Southern, the right-wing influencer who now is publicly questioning the Tradwife lifestyle and mindset that she once embraced and promoted a lot. And in part two of our discussion, we react to the death sentence given to Iranian hip-hop star Tumaj Salahi for his political speech and more particularly criticism of the government through his lyrics and his music. Hello, welcome to the Call It Like I See It podcast. I'm James Keys, and riding shotgun with me today is a man. Well, maybe this time I'll let you guess who's Bizak. It's Tunde Ogunlana. Tunde Ogunlana. Ready to talk to me, man?
Of course, man. That was a nice surprise. One of my favorite songs.
All right.
One of the last times we heard the great Scarface on an album. Maybe not the last time. But.
Yeah, I was going to say maybe the last time you did. Now, before we get started, if you enjoy the show, I ask that you hit the subscribe or like button on YouTube or your podcast app. Doing so really helps the show out. Now, we're recording this on May 14th, 2024. And Tunde, you and I may not have been following Lauren Southern, but she's been a substantial influencer in right-wing circles for many years now. And she's young, so she's been doing this and, for a good chunk of her life. And she has really, one thing she was really big into and promoted a lot was what's called the Tradwife, like traditional wife, Tradwife lifestyle, which is kind of a focus on a nurturing, feminine, domestic role for women that's promoted, in right-wing circles and, by traditionalists, quote unquote. But now, after experiencing a difficult and toxic marriage where she tried to live out this lifestyle, she's publicly questioning the rigid approach and the mindset behind it. So Tunde, what do you make of this story and her evolution from kind of this absolutist mindset to a more nuanced, thought process and kind of approach?
Yeah, this is a good question because I am new to this person, Lauren Southern. But like you said, quickly realized that she has been very popular and has had a big following for years. It might have been a bigger following prior to her getting off the internet grid and when she was married and some of the things that she discussed that she went through in the last 4 or 5 years. So, I find this very interesting. I know we'll deal with this throughout the conversation and later on, but there's just this idea of the evolution that made me realize that you and I and everyone, let's say that's older than 30 at this point, got a chance to have our own evolutions privately for the most part. I mean, unless you were a child star or an entertainment or something like that. But she's an example, and I think we're going to see more of this over time, of people now that, like I say, people under 30, I mean, their whole life is online. Yeah. So you're going to have people like you and I mean, I used to say some things that I'm not proud of now, looking back at my teenage years, ways to talk about other people and things like that. And, I don't have to deal with
verbally, that. And it wasn't recorded for posterity.
Correct. That's what I was going to say. I don't have to deal with that if I go for job interviews today, or if I wanted to become a public figure, run for office or something. I don't have to worry about someone digging up stuff from my late teens or my early 20s because I'm 46 years old and the social media didn't exist at that point, especially the way it does today. So that's why I find this interesting, this kind of arc of a person. And she's very young. I mean, I think she's only 28 or 29 right now.
Yeah, and we're talking about an evolution of a person.
That's what I mean. So I think from that standpoint, it's very interesting to watch a person grow like this. And I use that term specifically, that she's appeared to have grown as a person. And I've watched her in preparation for today. I watched a couple of interviews with her. And what I appreciate is as much as she's grown in this area of her life, she's also quick to say, don't assume that I changed all my views, and that I'm still the base core person that I was, but I'm willing to stand up and say that my approach to this specific topic of the Tradwife and this fantasy about marriage and all that was wrong. And here's what I have to say about it. So, if she can help more women avoid the negative stuff she went through, hey, more power to her. That's kind of my attitude.
It's really, I mean, the nuance piece is really I think the biggest takeaway from that, and that because you say it was wrong, and that's not to say that it's wrong for everyone or that it can't work, but I think what you have to understand with this time when people preach this type of thing is it's a very absolutist thing to say. They're not saying that, hey, this might work for you. Try this out. If not, you can try some other alternatives. The kind of Tradwife mindset is that this is what is for everyone. And so this is like kind of universal and necessary. So to go from an absolutist, this is the only way to do it, to say, hey, different people can figure out different ways to do something, is an evolution. But that is in itself a repudiation of the kind of Tradwife mindset, because that is a rigid mindset saying that this is what's for everyone. I look at this, and what really stands out to me about this, though, is looking beyond just the actual story and looking at how we focus on, and we've talked a lot about how the current media ecosystems, whether it be news media that's siloed, or social media which can silo your news and silo whatever, how that may change people. And there's a bias in that because we're in our 40s. And so we're looking at it like, okay, yeah, we were something before, or we have friends that were something before, and then we've seen them evolve into something more. And again, that's social media, but that's also just traditional media. Like traditional media does the same thing. We've seen studies where if you have somebody who watches, Fox News nonstop, and then if you take them out of that for 4 weeks and have them watch something else, they're extremism, or their extreme of the extremity of their views will change. Their positions won't necessarily, their ideology won't change, but they won't necessarily think everything is as dire. So it actually does change based on what they're consuming. What was interesting to me about this was that this wasn't about her experiencing the current media environment as the teenager and then as a young adult and changing who she was. She went to these sources, and that she was engaged in this and developing who she initially was. And so she was drawn to these kind of messages on the internet as a teenager and built her kind of persona around it. And so to me, that was very interesting. And that this is something that we're, like you said, we're going to see more of. And I would imagine we are, because this is what's happening. And again, a 40-year-old won't necessarily understand this because this is a generation below them. But it's like so many people right now are developing their understanding of the world in online spaces, which online spaces often lacks context, often lacks like the kind of real world experience that, can moderate views, can say, okay, like and online, it's easy to say everything works for, or this one thing can work for everybody or anything like that. But when you live, then it's kind of like, and when you're interacting with people, you can see that one size doesn't necessarily fit all in the world. So to me, that was what really stood out, is just watching her talk about her development as a person, and her kind of initially setting her ideas one way and then living a little bit and being like, oh, wow, that was very narrow what I learned.
Yeah. And, it's a very interesting conversation because you bring up some interesting things, like when going back to the idea of is this a right or wrong lifestyle? She does acknowledge in the interview that she did with the publication that she knows people that are absolutely,
we'll have the,
that she knows people that are absolutely miserable in these relationships now, that she's got a group chat in her WhatsApp that, she calls the Underground Railroad for Tradwife, some of these Tradwife women that are having a very miserable time. And she says there's people that she knows that are living a very healthy marriage and they're both happy and so on and so forth. So I think it's a good point you make, that this whole idea of how to live and be with someone and be married and the way you be married and all that, go back to the idea of our country, right? The freedom of the individual. We all have the right to live how we want to live. And I think, she unfortunately discovered the hard way that really, I'm not going to blame Tradwife. I'm just going to say she married the wrong guy. She married someone that appears to be very selfish and treated her like crap. And so, to defend him, we only got one side of the story right now. But, if what she's saying is true, which I have no reason, not to believe her. I'm just saying that the idea that somehow this should reflect at all on the way people get married. I mean, what happens, like you said, I think more specifically, is that she was a young person. And, the article, even I'll allude to it, it says by the time she met her husband, she'd been condensing conservative values into listicle form as a media influencer for some years. to the point where it seemed possible to realize this framework in real life too. And to me, that's very interesting, because that's what I'm saying is that is more like she sold herself on this idea that all the contemporary way of looking at marriage and life and these complexities and nuances were just wrong. And that somehow, and I think a lot of people are doing that with other areas in today's world as well in our life, which is, this all seems complicated and scary out there. I don't really understand what's going on. But you know what? This here on the internet is telling me that it could be this easy.
It's a
if everybody else
simplification.
just figured it out. And I think that's what happened, is she realized, and this is a cool thing about watching her evolve, is like, no, it's actually complicated. And I had a baby, and this guy was treating me like crap, and I had to make decisions. And so I think that's one interesting thing to see. And then the other interesting thing to see is the regular fault lines that, one of the words I really like is that word schadenfreude. Like, now you see people coming out of the woodwork saying, haha, I told you so. And it's just like, and this isn't a conservative or liberal thing. This is just what people do to each other, unfortunately. So again, I think we're going to have to get used to seeing this more often with people, that they evolve over their life, and to not beat them up all the time just because maybe they came around to an idea that you already had. Maybe we should just be celebrating, hey, that's one less person that's going to be promoting this kind of stuff that could end up having other women be in a position of vulnerability. Maybe she'll be someone that can champion, looking for the right man, and also teaching men how to behave in a relationship.
Well, that was something. I mean, and that's mentioned in the article. The questions asked, well, like the kind of Tradwife, very submissive kind of lifestyle. Is there a selection bias there in terms of the kind of men that are drawn to that? Yeah, that are looking for that. That men that may want to, have do things that they might not be able to get away with in a more equitable distribution, or setup with power sharing and kind of authority sharing and life. When you share your lifestyle, but to me, I think, and then the word I want to add to what you just said is like, she developed an affinity and like a kind of a view of these kind of concepts and lifestyle approaches in the abstract, but it was divorced from kind of real life experience. And so, I mean, and this is how we learn. So I'm not even saying that this is unique to now. The unique piece about now is that historically, I would imagine the kind of habits and thoughts that you had on the way to live came from very proximate to you. And that could be good or bad. It could be from your parents, your household, or things that were happening in your family or neighbors or neighborhoods and stuff like that. And so that's how you're kind of learning what works and what doesn't work, or at least what you think works and what doesn't work. But you're looking at real life things. And so it could lead you astray. If you're from a house where there's domestic violence and stuff like that, that can lead you astray. But you still are learning in a real life context. When you're learning from pure media sources, particularly when you're divorced from the context, when you're young, you're going to be divorced from the context in many respects, or you're just not going to be able to modulate, so to speak, when you're learning things. And balance that against real world experience. It's just you're more inclined to take it as gospel if it speaks to you a certain way. It's just coming from other sources, and it's all in the abstract. It's not like, oh, I'm seeing this relationship and these people and they look happy or whatever, or I'm seeing these people and they don't look happy or whatever. So you're learning about these things in the abstract. But again, you could learn bad lessons then. And so part of life is the development. So yeah, I mean, I think you see somebody kind of come into these realizations, like, I don't know that this is something you want to mock somebody for. I mean, like, we're all learning lessons in life, so to speak. If we're smart enough to, if we allow ourselves to kind of not continue to bang our head against the same wall, because nobody's coming from a place or starting at a place or ending up in a place where they have nothing left to learn. So, I mean, I think the real takeaway here, the thing that I really, took note of here was more about just kind of the source of how she kind of formulated her worldview on how she wanted to live. Not even like how she formulated her worldview on, we know this happens with like people's worldview on immigration or people's worldview on like political issues. But this is like, she formulated a worldview on how she wanted to live and then tried to put that in place. And then was like, okay, yeah, this, at least, in the setup I have now, this isn't for me. And, pushing back on, because you live life long enough. And a lot of times, not all the time, but a lot of times you learn the kind of the absolutist approach. While it may be appealing in its simplicity, it's difficult to say one size fits all. But the author, and I want to ask you about this because I thought it was interesting that the author, several times, the author was coming from a different perspective where she said that from her perspective, she was looking at it more from and when she was growing up, she looked at things and kind of was drawn to, in the same kind of way, online sources or media sources to left-wing things. And so her growth curve, she seemed to be a little further along in the growth curve, is that she was going down similar, not similar, but kind of rabbit holes in similar ways on left-wing side, and different things in terms of just trying to find herself or what's normal and what's not, and learning that from left-wing sources. So she's living in a commune and things like that. And then as she grew up, she learned like, okay, well, yeah, this stuff isn't for me. What did you think of the kind of comparison that the author drew to saying, hey, this doesn't just happen and take people down right-wing directions. This can also happen taking people down other directions.
No, I thought it was, look, I think she was trying to balance the article out, and especially, the author stated that she used to be a far left kind of a little bit more radical, I guess, in that direction in her youth. And I think she was trying to be fair-minded, which is fine, and point out that, hey, on my side,
try to find commonality. Yeah.
And I think, look, there's truth to that, right? People on the left and far left that are absolutists are no different than people on the right that are the same way. And I think that's really what I think comes out of kind of maybe this era we're in. Everyone wants to point in all these labels and left and right. I think there's just, kind of some people are more authoritarian in how they view, how they want to approach everyone else. And they're more absolutist, and they think that because they got some good idea in their head and the points we're making, right, that things that are complex, whatever their issue is, there's a certain complexity that they're uncomfortable with, and they think that if you just do it my way, this way, and just listen to me, and it'll be simpler and we'll get it done, and any other ideas are a threat. And so, I would say as just preparing for today, and in my mind, I was thinking about things like what we're seeing on these college campuses. And again, I don't know if those kids are far left, if they're center left, if they're right wing, I don't know. But the idea that somehow this complex issue in Israel and Palestine and Gaza and all that is just going to get solved because, your school divests from Israel or something like that. Again, that's a very simple way to look at it. And, it got me thinking about things, just on, I would say, the left of center side in American discussions on politics, like, anti-capitalism, that, defund the police, a very simplistic idea of how to deal with the complexities of our justice system. And even things like, like the anti-colonial stuff, some of the stuff we hear on the college campuses, it got me thinking like, well, like a school like Columbia, the name is Lenape tribe, were the original natives that were there. So if there's argument about anti-colonialism and divesting of all this stuff and giving land back to the indigenous people, then everybody except Native Americans need to get out of the United States, including me and you. So, the complexities of being a human being and living in a world that has a lot of people and migration and different religions and different
a lot of history and
history. And we're all shoved together, especially a nation like this that's not homogeneous. A lot of immigrants come in with different histories and religions. That's what I mean. She's an interesting door into a bigger discussion in our society today about how the internet has kind of warped people into thinking, number one, that there's probably more problems than there ever was, and number two, that we can just have these simple answers in these 6-7 minute clips on YouTube by famous people. I don't even want to name them just to not trigger people here, but like the these famous online personalities now that are giving us all these answers, and they somehow, the same person every night talking about something different is an expert in all these subjects. So yeah, I think it's a good comparison that both the left and the right have these forces, and I guess it's just whichever side gets funded more is the one that more people see.
Maybe. I don't think that I think equivalencies are dangerous when you when you effort to say, okay, well, what's happening here is the same as what's over there. There you can see kind of reflections of it. And I think the biggest distinction that you have to look out for, and this isn't unique to quote unquote left or right. this is unique to the type of individuals you're dealing with, or people who there are people who want to persuade you to live a certain way or to do things a certain way. And then there are people who want to impose on you to do things a certain way or to live a certain way. And that's the key distinction to me. And so I wouldn't protesters who want to say they want their school to divest, if they're trying to persuade by using mass demonstration, I think that's healthy. I think that's what we want. I don't think that we should mock them or try to demean them and say they're trying to solve the problem. It's like, well, no, let's let us pull our funds back from contributing to the problem, so to speak. That may not solve the problem, but it's as opposed to sitting on our hands and doing nothing. If they go as far as to trying to impose their will on others, then that's where you draw the line. So now that's not always an easy distinction. Sometimes it is. If we're talking abortion bans, that is imposing. Like that's not persuasion. That's imposing. So I think that you have to be careful, though, basically. And because we have a lot of us, fair-minded people have a natural inclination to want to say, oh, the same thing that's happening here is what's happening there. But just because the tactics if you're kind of a center left or a center right person, what people may be asking for may be abrasive to you. You do still have to stop and say, okay, are they trying to impose a certain way on everyone else, or are they trying to persuade people to live a certain way? Now, with the author, I found it notable that she tried to kind of chime in and say, hey, yeah, like the idea of trying to find your way and being influenced by what you're reading online in the abstract happens in other contexts. I thought that was very valuable, because it's either because of the way just kind of what gets promoted or what we see a lot more of this on, like I tend to see at least, like the Tradwife or, the alt-right stuff. We see a lot of that, and so to say, okay, yeah, there are also people happening. And maybe we're seeing that with the school protests and anti-colonialism. There are these ideas, these absolutist ideas that are percolating around from all over. And we should be aware of this as well. I thought it was very helpful to the discussion, because it does center the fact on this, or center it on the idea of absolute positions versus the ability to take in information and be able to. Now, you can be principled and not necessarily be absolute. An absolute position does not necessarily mean or not having an absolute position doesn't mean you're not principled. So, but to say that these kind of threats are ever present, and again, the alliance has to be amongst rational and reasonable people. The alliance has to be among people who are people who can live and let live. And it's against the people who are trying to impose whatever they want on everybody else. And that can come from any direction. And I think that's the key there, is just that whatever direction it's coming from, if your objective is to persuade, fine, you can try to persuade. But once you go into the realm of trying to say, okay, I want to live like this, so I'm going to say everybody has to live like this, then in my opinion, you've crossed the line, and you are then against a pluralist society at that point.
Yeah, I think, you make a good point, which is why it's so nuanced, because if you get back to just like the current protests, you're right. You can be principled and say, I want to protest against the harming of civilians in Gaza and the use of, certain weapons and all that. And dropping these big bombs on, just to get one guy on a refugee camp and killing 100 people. So there's humanitarian principles that you can espouse and want to protect innocent people. However, the point you made, that's what I'm saying, is on a lot of these protests, there's people talking about the colonialism and anti-capitalism, and this is all big bad people trying to make money and all that. And I think, and then of course, when you get to the anti-Semitism and all that stuff, you really get into people being off the reservation, right? And I think,
to your point, if you're principled on the idea of which I would consider myself like, hey, you shouldn't be dropping bombs on camps to get one person if you're killing 100 innocent people. You also have to be principled on the idea of Hamas shouldn't be running up into residential neighborhoods and kidnapping and killing civilians. The principle, there is no clean part. There are civilians and there are states and or non-state actors. The non-state actors and the state actors all seem to be crossing lines. The civilians all seem to be in, so it's civilians on both sides. If you're going to be principled, it's civilians on both sides that you need to be speaking up for, not just civilians on one side, because the civilians seem to be losing across the board here. But go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah. No, and that's where I think, going back to just the Lawrence Southern and the Tradwife thing, we could see that in that, right? One could make good arguments and discussions about relationships and how you should treat people, and having it a male and a female, mom and dad in a household, and the homemaker versus the guy that's out there, hunting and gathering, and those are all fair discussions. But what she got into was domestic abuse. So there's a line, and I think that's what we're talking about, is that a lot of these, unfortunately, the internet, and I think this is what's interesting watching her too, or just reading and getting to learn who she is. I kind of do feel sorry now for younger people, like people 30 and under, because, I'm realizing as I read this, number one, I say this with a smile, I realize I'm middle-aged. I'm getting old now. And the reason is because, number one, like you say, we have had time now in our life to go through some of these. I was a little more absolutist and ideological or about certain things when I was younger, which I've since calmed down about and learned that everything is nuanced. But then the idea that like she is able to go through this experience in front of all of us, and that she admits that she was influenced by the online world. And I'm thinking like, yeah, like at least you and I, when we were born, there was a certain sources of information. We got taught how to look in an encyclopedia and dictionary. I mean, literally, sometimes I text that to my kids, my older kids, that, just look this up. And then I can appreciate now younger people don't have the ability to trust things, which means that they accept a lot of things that us older people look at and think, man, you really believe that?
Well, but it's a different, and I don't want to go down this road but it's a different thing, because they've been conditioned to, because of the way television and the internet, because of the way we experience that, if you grew up in an era, in certain eras, you've been conditioned to accept it. We're more conditioned to accept things that we see on TV, particularly certain stations, than generations before us, because it's like, TV is a reputable source. So especially if it's something that if it's confirmation bias, but before you get too far away, I want to ask you about this. And that is the idea of one of the things that stood out in both of us when we were talking about this before the show. It was the idea of how you get a person can get, when all of your opinions and all of the things that you've as you've taken all this information in from television or the internet or whatever, and you kind of develop your persona and you put all that, you're not just talking about that amongst your friends, you're posting that online, and that's, for everybody to see. It can kind of lock you in, and you're kind of pot committed to a certain approach of life, and can make it harder to kind of change gears if you have experiences and you learn from that. I would say it takes a strong person to be able to say, hey, you know what? All of the stuff I've been saying, or not all the stuff, but all the stuff I've been saying about this subject, I think I was wrong, and I'm going to go a different direction. What do you think about that in terms of how difficult that would be, how that may be made more difficult in a world where you're contemporaneously learning and posting, so to speak, and you're always kind of telling everybody else what you're thinking, and then you may not want to, even if you start having second thoughts about what you're thinking, you may not want to change, just because that's kind of your persona. That's what everybody knows you as, and you don't want to seem, weak or flimsy or whatever by switching back and forth, or switching from that.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking to a guy whose only online exposure through anything related to social media is this show. So, I mean, I used to have a Facebook account back in the day.
You're on LinkedIn, aren't you?
Yeah, I'm on it. Do I use it? That's a different story.
Not posting a bunch on it.
Yeah, no, unfortunately. So, no, that's what I'm saying. So I'm not someone who's steeped in being online a lot in terms of social media and all that. But one reason I got off was because of exactly what you're saying, is I did feel that it was starting to change my own perception of myself in certain ways. I would find myself, I'm talking, we're 5+ years ago, I was on Facebook, and I remember doing all that. Like, if I got a certain amount of likes for a post, I felt good. And if, next day I posted something and it only got 2 likes, I'm kind of like, man, how come I don't have more likes?
You spend 30 minutes thinking about it. Yeah.
Yeah. And I just started thinking, like, why do I care about this? Why am I allowing this to dominate my brain? And I got off it, period. And so I think that if you are a persona, I got to imagine it's very difficult if you built a certain persona for yourself, which is also a value set for yourself, which is also then a community, because the people online are a community, and we are human beings who want community and who engage in social relationships. It's part of how we're wired. So I do think it could be very difficult. And that's why I commend this young lady for having kind of courage to speak out and take the incoming fire. that comes along with it.
Which is
But I
coming,
also started,
from the same circles that she used to be, be praised
yeah,
from. Those right wing ecosystems now are criticizing her for her reversal on the idea that Tradwife is for everyone should be the only thing anybody does.
yeah, and we've seen this before. As I was thinking about, I was like, this is similar to like Malcolm X after he went on the Hajj and changed from being a militant, kind of Nation of Islam guy to being a moderate pluralist that said, hey, everybody shares this earth, and God loves everybody.
I don't think if there was anybody that was guessing, I don't think there would any scenario that somebody would think that Lauren Southern would get compared to Malcolm X on any show anywhere. So you got the most far out connection, but it's 100% accurate. Don't get me wrong.
Well, my next one is interesting too.
You got another one?
Then I thought about no, seriously. I was just thinking about it. It's interesting how people do make these big life changes, but we usually learn about them in the abstract. I think Malcolm X was one of the few of that era that when we didn't have internet and all that made his change in real time.
It's an excellent comparison, man, because then he caught arrows from where he had, the people he had previously been aligned with. I mean, it's very good,
And the other example though is Clarence Thomas. I was thinking about it, which is night and day with Malcolm X, but the idea that he was a member of the Black Panther Party in the 1960s. A lot of people don't know that. So, that's one we've learned of after the fact, that he was more militant in pro-Black stuff when he was a young kid. And somewhere in the late 70s and the 80s, he changed he changed how he felt about, politics and everything else. So no, but I'm just saying it's a pretty amazing evolution for a person. These are pretty extreme examples I'm giving, but I'm giving them for a reason, that this isn't new.
The X and the Southern one is different, like in how publicly they were committed to something and then made a public switch.
I agree, but that's why I said
Clarence Thomas wasn't necessarily
no,
of the
but
same
imagine
prominence.
if he had Twitter and Instagram back when he was 20 and he was a member of the Black Panther Party. He might have been spewing some stuff online that would have derailed his ability to make those changes later, because he would have been trying to apply to government jobs during the Reagan administration like he did. And, he was the head of the EEOC at one point in the 80s. And they might have looked at his post and said, dude, hold on, what are you talking about? You can't hire this guy. So that's what I mean is we could, and that's what I meant when I started our discussion by saying, we older generations could make these changes a little bit more in private. Whereas even though, Lauren Southern's an example of someone who was already a popular influencer and then made the change. But those of us who are just regular folks, because if I was 15 now, I'd probably have a Twitter account and an Instagram account. So I'd be posting stuff that's going to stay with me forever. So if I was 30,
and that shows your age right there, because you would have a TikTok account if you were 15 right
sorry.
now. Twitter, come on, man.
Sorry.
Next thing you know, you're going to be telling 15-year-olds to have MySpace pages.
I got to take that. No, but I got to take that arrow to the face, because you're right. I got no comeback. That was the old man. That was the old man coming out.
But you're saying two different things, though. You're saying on one hand, there's the difficulty of someone who publicly has espoused certain views and promoted certain views and then making a switch. And yes, that requires a lot of intestinal fortitude, so to speak, like a lot of, in you internally, internal strength, versus and you're pointing out also the difficulty that newer generations face, younger generations face, because they're kind of pot committed publicly, even if they're not a public figure. Malcolm X was a public figure. That's the reason why he was pot committed publicly versus, and then Lauren Southern was a media personality or social media person, whatever. She would, so she had built up a online kind of, and just a public persona, so that the idea of the public persona being able to change, I think, is something like we've observed it throughout history. You gave an interesting example, in Malcolm X, it fit, but we've seen it throughout. But I think the point is that it makes it hard. But the more interesting on rank and file people, like not people who are prominent, I do think the difficulty, I hope basically, because life is about, if you're smart enough to, you should still keep learning. And if you keep learning, your mindset on things should evolve, or can evolve. Some things, I'm not going to say that everything shouldn't be absolute. Like I can name things that I don't think are, I would say absolutely are wrong, like pedophilia. Absolutely. Like you're not going to be able to give me a scenario where it's like, oh, well, like that's just wrong. But that's more of the kind of the smaller things that are not smaller in scale, but like smaller in terms of like this issue. Yes. Okay. I can name it. But a lot of issues that we deal with are issues where context perspective matters. Context and perspective matters. So as you get more context, more life and so forth, then your mindset on these things, or at minimum, whether your mind changes as a general principle, or you just become more open to the idea of, oh, well, in certain scenarios, things might not necessarily have to play out just one way. You got to leave yourself space to grow and evolve. And I basically, to your point, I agree that if you're all online, everything, like if you maybe in 20 years ago, you might have just been telling your friends, and then you got to like, oh, I thought you were never, you said you would never get married. Now you're getting married. Ha ha ha. But like now, it's kind of like it's much more than that, because you may feel beholden to a bunch of people you don't know to maintain a certain kind of mindset and approach to living life, which is just more pressure. And, where people would just have to overcome that, like it's just, but it's something to, I guess, to take note of more than anything. So you got anything else before we close this one up?
Yeah, no, I got just a couple more just for fun. One is I'm reading this thing about Lauren Southern. That's what I said. She was born in 1995. I'm thinking, man, she's young. And that's what I'm thinking, like, hold on. I appreciate really that she's talking this way in public. But then I'm thinking about, so 5 years ago and 7, 8 years ago when she was such an influencer and so popular, I'm thinking like this was an 18-year-old kid. So part of me was also realizing like, man, we as the older people in our society also got to maybe do a better job of not giving these kids so much attention. Because
it may not be the older people giving her attention. It maybe she was an 18-year-old influencer for 16-year-olds, and for
a lot of the stuff I saw was, adults basically, being very engaged in a lot of these discussions with younger people.
Maybe that's confirmation bias at work. If they're saying things, if she's saying things that they like, but be careful,
I'm just
because we're in our 40s doing a show that references her, and she's 28,
No. What I'm saying is that there's a lot of people that were on the, I would say, feminist side of these arguments when I was going back and reading. I'm talking people like grown women our age arguing with a 16-year-old because she's saying some stuff like that. And I think it's like, well, of course she's a kid. She doesn't know anything yet. She has to go through experiences, which she did.
But so you're saying you wouldn't challenge her in that case? Like if she's a kid, then you should challenge her. I would
say this. I think just as the internet has created so many more nuances for us as humanity in our society, I think those of us who are nuanced, need to do a better job at approaching some of the way that these topics get discussed, especially when it's coming from someone that is a kid, that's immature, that doesn't have life experience yet. And because what I realize, and
I don't get what you're saying. So what would be, so somebody's 18 and they're posting stuff online. What do you say you're supposed to do? A mature person is supposed to do?
Maybe you don't respond.
And so you just let them influence the 16.
I guess so. Like, because here's another thing.
Like a workable,
it's maybe there isn't an answer. That's, I guess, what I'm coming to my conclusion here. Maybe it's just, we got to go through this as a culture for a generation or two for there to be a new normal with how we as a society deal with this kind of internet traffic of conversations.
But I think any new normal is going to involve exchanges of ideas. If you want to exchange ideas, I don't think based on how old you are, you should either be immune from somebody challenging what you say or anything like that. Like that's just a part of it. Now, I would say we don't need to be out there if they're 40 or if they're 18 or whatever. Like if you disagree with somebody saying, like, explain why you disagree. And it doesn't necessarily need to become, hey, let's just call this person names or, give them, dirty nicknames or whatever. Like, but if somebody wants to get involved and they're 18 or they're 16 or they're 58 with the exchange of ideas, like in an open society, that's their right to do. And other people have their right to challenge them. And ideally,
I'm not saying they don't have a right or shouldn't have a right. What I'm saying is, like, if a 15-year-old kid, let's say I'm on a bus or a train and they start talking smack, I can say to myself, it's a kid. No, but what I'm saying, James, is that for whatever reason, the internet just draws people out more with their emotions.
But it's a medium of exchange. And so, if you're going to jump into the medium, then you can expect blowback. I don't think that that's something that based on age that you should then be immune to that. So, but I'm not
saying you should be. I think you're misunderstanding. What I'm saying is the older people should take more time.
They should respond.
No, I didn't say they shouldn't. I'm just saying they shouldn't give it so much attention. That's all. My point is why make a 16-year-old person that powerful when you're older and you kind of know better?
You're not making them powerful, though. Like, you're misunderstanding the nature of the power. People who draw attention, then you're saying, oh, well, I'll ignore them and that will take away their power. And it's like, well, no, you're not the only person whose attention matters, So But I like, again, we got to keep moving,
that's
man.
not what my mommy told me. Come on.
For sure. But no, we appreciate everybody for joining us on this episode. We're going to wrap this one from here. We'll have part 2 coming up shortly. Thank you for joining us on part 1. And so, but be sure to check out part 2 as well.